My name is Martha Reynolds. And for most of my life, I believed a mother's love could conquer anything. I thought that if I worked hard enough, forgave often enough, and gave every piece of myself, my son would always be my safe place. But that belief ended the afternoon I heard the click of a lock from the outside of my own home. It was quiet, too quiet. I remember standing by the door, frozen, the cold metal of the knob unmoving beneath my hand. A few seconds later, the sound of his footsteps faded, and I realized he wasn't coming back. My phone lay shattered on the floor, its cracked screen still glowing faintly, as if mocking me. The air smelled of dust and old wood. I could hear my own breathing, shallow and sharp. For a moment, I tried to tell myself there must be a reason. That maybe he was angry. Maybe he'd come back in a minute. But deep inside, I already knew. The boy I once rocked to sleep, the same boy I swore I'd protect from the world, had become the man who would rather lock me away than face his own guilt. That moment changed everything. Standing there in the silence, I realized love, no matter how deep, can be twisted into something unrecognizable. I didn't know it then. But that sound, the soft click of a lock, was the beginning of my story. The story of how everything I built began to fall apart. I still remember the quiet that followed that day, the kind that fills a house when all the noise of life has left it. That silence carried me back to another time, decades earlier, when everything had just begun. I was 18 when I first walked into the textile factory on the corner of Maple and 4th. The air was thick with the scent of cotton and machine oil, and the hum of the sewing lines filled every corner like a heartbeat. My hands were soft back then, still unmarked by years of labor. I didn't know it yet. But those hands would become my way of surviving, of building a life for my son, Ethan. When my husband left, Ethan was only 7. He had his father's eyes bright and trusting, and for a long time, I couldn't bear to see them filled with confusion. So I did the only thing I knew. I worked. I picked up every extra shift, took in hemming jobs from neighbors, and saved every dollar I could. My fingertips were raw from threading needles in the cold. But when I saw Ethan sleeping peacefully under a patched quilt I'd sewn myself, every ache faded. The winters were the hardest. The wind would rattle through the old windows, and I'd walk to work before dawn, my breath fogging the air. Sometimes I'd skip breakfast, so there'd be enough milk left for him. I'd sit by the heater at lunch, sipping plain tea, thinking of the sandwich waiting for him after school. It wasn't sadness that kept me going, it was purpose. There was one night I'll never forget. Ethan had come home from school embarrassed because his shoes had torn at the heel. He was too proud to say it, but I could see it in the way he tried to hide them under the table. That night, I stayed up until nearly 2:30 in the morning, sewing a new pair from scraps of old leather a friend had given me. The next morning, when he smiled and said they fit perfectly, it felt like I'd been handed the world. Every milestone in his life was stitched with my hands: his school uniforms, his birthday cakes baked after midnight, his college tuition paid from years of saving coins in a jar on the kitchen counter. When he turned 16, I used my overtime pay to buy him a used motorcycle. I still remember the look on his face, that mix of pride and disbelief. For me, it was worth every hour spent on aching feet. When he graduated with honors, I sat in the back of the hall in a plain navy dress, my hands clasped so tightly they trembled. I thought of every long night, every tear I had hidden behind a smile. And I told myself it was all worth it. My son was walking into a future brighter than anything I had ever known. Back then, I truly believed that love, hard work, and sacrifice could build something unbreakable. I believed that everything I had given would come back to me in kindness, in gratitude, in love returned. But as I would soon learn, Even the strongest foundation can crack when someone new steps in and decides your life no longer fits their picture of perfection. I remember the first time I met Lena. It was a Sunday afternoon. The kind of day when sunlight spills softly through the curtains, making everything look gentler than it really is. Ethan had called the night before, saying he wanted me to meet someone special. I'd spent the morning cooking his favorite meal. The same one I used to make when he was a boy: roast chicken, mashed potatoes, and a pie cooling on the windowsill. I even wore my best dress, the one with the pale blue flowers, because I wanted to make a good impression. When she walked through the door, the air seemed to change. Lena was beautiful, elegant, in a way that made the room feel smaller. Her voice was smooth, her smile polite, her eyes sharp enough to cut through any pretense of warmth. She looked around my little house as if taking inventory, her gaze settling on the worn edges of the furniture, the framed pictures on the wall, the old lace curtains I had sewn myself. There was something about her presence that made me suddenly aware of every imperfection. I tried my best to make her comfortable. I served her the meal I had worked all morning to prepare, watched her pick at it with delicate precision, and smiled when she offered compliments that didn't sound like compliments at all. In her words, my home was sweet, my efforts thoughtful, the tone was kind, but the distance was clear. I kept trying. I baked her favorite desserts once I learned what she liked. I offered small gifts, handmade scarves, little tokens meant to make her feel welcome. Each one was received with a smile that never reached her eyes. And slowly, I began to notice that Ethan no longer looked at me the way he used to. When he visited, he stayed quiet, glancing at her before speaking, as if measuring every word. The day they married, I sat in the front row, wearing the same blue dress I had worn when we first met. The ceremony was beautiful, but I felt invisible, as though I were watching someone else's son promise his life away. I smiled, but my heart felt heavy, hollow. That was the moment I began to understand the bond I had spent a lifetime nurturing was slipping through my fingers. And I couldn't stop it. Something cold had entered our lives. And deep down, I knew it would only grow colder. It started with a fever that wouldn't break, the kind that seeps into your bones and makes the world blur at the edges. I remember sitting at the kitchen table, the clock ticking softly, each second stretching longer than the last. The house felt colder than usual, though it was only early autumn. My body ached, my head pounded, and the silence pressed in from every wall. For years, Ethan had been the one I called when I needed help. Even after things changed, after Lena's soft smiles turned to sharp edges, I still believed that if I truly needed him, he would come. So, that evening, with trembling fingers, I picked up the phone. The screen glowed faintly against the dim light. My voice was weak when I spoke, asking him to take me to the doctor. Just for a checkup. Just for an hour of his time. There was a pause. Then a sigh. And something in his tone, something detached, almost impatient, told me everything before he even finished his sentence. He had other plans. Dinner. Something important. I hung up before the ache in my throat could turn into words I'd regret. I sat there for a long time, staring at the empty chair across from me. I thought of all the nights I had stayed awake sewing his school clothes. The mornings I'd walked through snow just to save bus fare. The years I'd spent building his dreams with my hands. I waited. I hoped. I believed. But hope doesn't cure a fever. And belief doesn't fill an empty room. That night, I lay in bed, shivering under thin blankets, every breath scraping against my chest. The house was silent, except for the faint creak of the floorboards and the sound of the wind outside. And in that stillness, something inside me cracked, not loudly, but deeply. Like ice breaking underfoot. For the first time, I let myself see the truth I had been avoiding. Love, no matter how pure, cannot survive when it is not returned. I had spent my entire life giving, believing that sacrifice was the language of love. But what I had built wasn't love anymore, it was dependence, obligation, and silence. When the fever finally broke 2 days later, I sat back at the kitchen table, weak but awake in a way I hadn't been for years. The morning light came through the window, soft and pale, touching the surface of my cold cup of tea. I realized I didn't need to wait by the phone anymore. I didn't need to keep proving my worth to someone who had already decided I wasn't enough. That was the moment everything began to change, not with anger, but with a quiet, steady decision. I would stop begging for love that no longer existed. I would start living for me. And for the first time in my life, that thought didn't scare me, it set me free. The days after my illness passed slowly, like sunlight creeping through the cracks of a long-closed window. For the first time in years, I wasn't waiting for a phone call or an apology that would never come. The quiet no longer felt like punishment, it felt like peace. Each morning, I began to walk through the park near my home. My steps unsteady at first, then surer. I'd listen to the rustle of leaves overhead and the distant laughter of children. And something inside me began to thaw. Grace, my neighbor, would stop by with tea every afternoon around 2:30. We'd sit by the kitchen window, talking about nothing important, the weather, the birds, the flowers starting to bloom again. Her kindness reminded me that not all love demands something in return. Those small moments shared silence. Soft laughter stitched me back together in ways I hadn't realized I was broken. I began to fill my days with small acts of care for myself. Cleaning the house not out of duty, but out of pride. Rearranging the old photographs. Not to dwell on the past but to make peace with it. I even started writing again small notes in a journal I hadn't touched since my 20s. Some pages were filled with pain. Others with gratitude. Each word felt like a step toward myself. Then, one morning, Ethan called. His voice was calm, almost casual, asking me to make one of Lena's favorite dishes for a dinner they were hosting. For a moment, my old instincts flared the urge to please, to serve, to prove my worth. But it faded as quickly as it came. I took a breath, felt the weight of all those years lift, and simply said no. Not with anger, not with resentment, just quiet certainty. The silence on the other end stretched long, but I didn't feel it this time. When the call ended, I felt something shift inside me, a strength so gentle it almost felt like forgiveness. For once, I wasn't the mother waiting to be needed. I was a woman standing on her own 2 feet. That afternoon, as the light poured through the kitchen window, I realized I no longer belonged to the pain of my past. I belonged to myself. And though I didn't know it yet, that strength, the peace I had fought so hard to find, was about to be tested in ways I never imagined. It happened on a quiet Saturday morning. I was in the garden trimming the last of the roses when I saw their car pull up, the shine of its polished surface catching the sunlight like a warning. Ethan stepped out first, followed by Lena, dressed perfectly as always. Her sunglasses hiding eyes that never missed a thing. I hadn't expected them, but a part of me wasn't surprised. People like that never come without a reason. They greeted me with smiles too wide, voices too sweet. I could feel the performance in every word. They spoke of concern, of care, of thinking about my future. Their phrases sounded soft, but each one carried the weight of control. As they talked about comfortable communities and safe environments for seniors, my mind began to piece together the truth behind the words. What they wanted wasn't my safety, it was my home. The place I had built from every drop of sweat. every sleepless night, every broken dream I had turned into survival. I listened quietly, nodding at the right moments, letting them believe their performance was working. Inside, though, something different stirred. I watched how Ethan's eyes flickered toward the living room, the furniture, the family photos on the mantel. I noticed the way Lena ran her fingers along the edge of the window frame, as if already imagining it repainted in her style. Their politeness was just a mask. And for the first time, I saw how thin it was. There was a time when I would have begged, pleaded, tried to make them see reason. But that woman, the one who thought love could erase cruelty, no longer lived here. I had learned that silence could be sharper than anger, and that sometimes the most dangerous power comes from patience. So, I played along. I thanked them for their thoughtfulness, told them I'd think about it. I even suggested I might call my lawyer to help make the transition smoother. I saw a flicker of triumph in Lena's expression, a spark of greed in Ethan's eyes. That's when I knew I was doing the right thing. Let them think they'd won. Let them underestimate me one last time. That afternoon, after they left, I sat at my kitchen table and made a list, not of what I was losing, but of what I was taking back. My dignity, my peace, my control. I would not let them take the home that built us both. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I poured myself a cup of tea and looked out the window. The air felt still, almost expectant. They thought I was old, weak, and easy to manipulate. They were wrong, very wrong. And soon, they would find out just how much. They came back 2 days later. Smiles bright, voices full of false warmth. They thought I'd surrendered, that I was the frail mother finally giving up control. I welcomed them in, offered tea, and listened as they spoke about the wonderful retirement home they had chosen. I kept my hands steady, my tone soft, and my heart still. They didn't need to know that everything was already set in motion. The day before, Mr. Cooper had sat right where Lena now placed her designer purse. Together, we had rewritten my will and reviewed the evidence I'd been quietly collecting for months: photographs, messages, financial records. Every piece of proof showing their manipulation and cruelty. I even set up my old laptop on the kitchen counter, connected to a live call with my lawyer and a local reporter. For the first time in years, I wasn't afraid. When I handed Ethan and Lena the fake copy of my will, they practically glowed with relief. I watched as their eyes skimmed the paper, saw their greed flash like a match struck in the dark. They believed every word of that document, the promise that my home, my savings, my life's work, would soon belong to them. Then I told them there was something I wanted to show them. I led them to the basement. The air cooler and quieter down there. On the walls hung neatly pinned documents, bank statements, photos, text transcripts, all carefully labeled and illuminated by a single hanging light. I watched their faces shift from triumph to horror as they began to understand. Every lie, every insult, every attempt to erase me, it was all right there. Visible and undeniable. My voice stayed calm as I explained what they were looking at. How every word had been recorded. How my lawyer and the reporter were listening right now. The silence that followed was heavy, almost sacred. For once, I didn't feel like a victim. I felt like justice itself had taken form in my hands. When the sound of police sirens echoed faintly from outside, I didn't flinch. I simply stood taller. They had built their comfort on my kindness, to their security on my silence, but both had finally ended. As the officers walked them out, I felt no hatred, only release. For so long, I had begged for love. Now, I understood something. Far greater dignity is the love you give yourself when the world tries to take it away. And that, I realized, was freedom. It's been months since that day. And my house feels different now, lighter. Quieter. Full of air and peace. Ethan lost everything he once thought mattered. But I gained something he never understood: myself. Justice didn't come from punishment. It came from finally standing tall, unafraid, and choosing dignity over pain. I've learned that love without respect isn't love, it's surrender. And peace doesn't come from others, it grows the moment you start honoring your own worth. If my story touched you, share it. Leave your thoughts below. And remember, no matter your age, it's never too late to choose peace.